welcome Dr. Sophie Quirk and Dr. Lavinia Bryden from the University of Kent School of Arts and Tom Sharkey, PhD candidate from Canterbury Christ Church University. Ladies and gents, over to you.
Morning. Okay, so hi, I'm Sophie Quirk. I'm a lecturer in drama. So this session is Rethinking Inclusive Employment Practices in Lockdown and what your business should learn from the live comedy industry. And the first thing I should say is that this isn't actually just for businesses. I know different kinds of organisations have registered for this, and we're absolutely talking to anyone who works in any kind of organisational context. So welcome to absolutely everybody, and thank you for being here. So just to let you know how this is going to run today, I'm going to talk for a bit about the comedy industry with reference to some key principles that are really useful for rethinking equality, diversity and inclusivity issues in a kind of range of contexts. So during the time that I'm kind of presenting, please do feel free to post any comments or questions or experiences you want to share in the chat. And during the presentation, we'll pause every now and then for the panel, which is myself, Tom and Lavinia, to kind of respond to those. After that presentation section, Lavinia and Tom are going to talk about how the principles we've identified in the comedy industry relate to a different kind of context, and we're hoping that's going to be a really useful springboard for all of you to think about those kinds of principles in your own work context as well. So when we get to that Q&A, that's another opportunity for you guys to ask questions, but you can ask questions as we go as well. So just to introduce us, as I say, I'm a lecturer in drama and theatre. Lavinia is senior lecturer in film studies. She's also the School of Arts director of EDI. And Tom Sharkey is a PhD candidate in politics and art at Canterbury Christ Church University. But we also want to flag that we've worked in a range of other contexts. So at the moment, we're all employed by universities, but we've also worked for other kinds of businesses, charities in the public sector as freelancers on precarious and permanent contracts, on particular projects that are funded for funders, and as managers, leaders, ground staff, volunteers in different organisations. And for you, we'd like to encourage you to think not just about your employees, but also about how these principles affect how you interact with your colleagues, stakeholders, service users and participants, contractors, co-producers, basically to think about your organisation as a really interlinked network involving everybody that you work with, because this isn't just about how we think the most useful way of thinking about this is not about how an employer does things for their employees, but about how everybody in the organisation is being encouraged to work in a particularly inclusive way. I also just want to flag up that we have anonymised some of the comments from particular practitioners, reason being that they were just provided in a context that wasn't quite like this, where they were going to be chopped out of context and recorded and put online. So where those are anonymised, big thank yous to the people who gave interviews and who aren't being identified here, and also to the British Stand-Up Comedy Archive, where some of the resources that we're not able to cite directly are held. For anyone who really wants and needs to know where a particular quote comes from, if you contact me separately, I'm really happy to help you out with that. So I'm going to start just by giving some context on the live comedy industry. I know some people in the call really know the live comedy industry well. For others, you might want a little bit of orientation about how this industry works. So this is a map of the comedy industry that was produced by the Live Comedy Association very recently. And the reason I'm showing this here is really just to give you an idea of how complex the comedy industry is. So we're going to be talking mainly today about comedians who are identified in the big purple box there, but you'll notice they're surrounded by all kinds of other creatives like graphic designers, that there are producers and directors, agents and people working for TV broadcasters, and all of these different roles obviously impact on the comedy world as well. I think an important thing to note at the outset about the comedy industry is this set of ideas about there being what's sometimes referred to by comedians as there's no HR, and that kind of is a common way of signalling that this is a very unusual industry in the informality and flexibility of its working arrangements. So individual comedians working on the live circuit don't have a boss, don't until recently have anything that stands in for a kind of union or trade body. The Live Comedy Association recently set up is trying to fill some of those gaps. But what comedians are generally doing is managing lots of relationships with individual promoters, so the people who book for clubs, and other people who are really important in terms of getting them work. And those things are often done in a way that looks like mates, or is sometimes mates putting their mates on stage, but also it always needs to look like mates putting their mates on stage. So they need to maintain friendly relationships. This wonderful article by Butler and Stoyanova Russell highlights just how much that involves comedians in emotional labour. So in controlling both perceptions of and actually their feeling of their own anxiety, frustration at things like not being paid on time and that sort of thing, all in order to maintain these really friendly relationships. And we're going to talk about how those situations can become very pernicious and dangerous. So an important point here, owing to the atomised nature of careers in comedy, comics are reluctant to risk forfeiting the prospect of paid work by demanding higher wages, improved working conditions or more punctual payment. And in fact, that this article doesn't address this in particular, but that could also be translated out to comedians being reluctant to demand better safety standards, for example. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. So why am I talking to you about the live comedy industry, and why do I think it can help all kinds of organisations? Well, in the first place, the discourse on equality and diversity and inclusivity and identity is really rapidly evolving. Anyone who is on Twitter knows that these things, there's sometimes these sort of tacit understandings about identity that are moving on really fast. Comedians are at the forefront of that discourse that is really quite difficult to keep up with, so they can be a really useful way of accessing the principles that people are kind of operating by. It's an industry and a set of practitioners who are often stridently and brutally self-reflexive. It has its arguments often in public, so it's comedians talking on stage or writing articles for newspapers or posting on social media, but they are not private very often about the difficulties they're identifying in their industry. So that means that we can see it, we can kind of see the things that are going on. Comedians also, they have this wonderful platform, even at entry level, where obviously there's lots of reasons why comedians might not talk about their experiences on stage, but many of them do. So we get lots of authentic and relatively unfiltered personal experience, and from a really diverse range of perspectives. As an industry, comedy has done some really inspiring things to redress inequalities and get its house in order. So there's some really wonderful things we can learn from the comedy industry in a really positive sense. But also, like most industries, there's a long history of inequality and some ingrained discriminatory habits. And the fact that the industry is quite self-reflexive about that means that we can learn from those as well. So it's being used as a case study, both because they do some things really well and because some things have been done really badly. So the summer of 2020 has been a really difficult one for the live comedy industry. So most obviously lockdown means live gigs have had to pause. And to compound that problem, we suspect that live performance in the way that we understood it in kind of small comedy club rooms or in big theatres of people being together is going to be one of the last things that returns. So the uncertainty about this happening anytime soon, allied with the fact that income and the possibility to do business has just dried up, has meant that there's a really, really profound challenge to the comedy industry. There's real concerns that it could seriously flounder, if not sort of disintegrate under this pressure. The Live Comedy Association has reported that already, so this was in July, a third of venues were already facing closure. 10% of workers said that they had already left. Nearly 60% predicted that unless something changed, they would need to be gone by February. And identity factors like gender, race, class, geographical location, all of these made people more likely to be at risk of needing to leave the industry. So it's a diversity crisis as well as a crisis for workers in all kinds of contexts in the industry. Black Lives Matter is not a crisis that obviously just happened. Black Lives Matter isn't the crisis. So the Black Lives Matter is responding to a crisis that has existed for a very long time. But I'm mentioning it here because this summer has made comedians and all kinds of artists really start to reflect on the moral and practical imperative to do better. And we've also seen some clumsiness in proceeding with that. So actually this quote here is from the American context and is from an actor. But I have chosen this because it so nicely encapsulates some of the debates that are going on across the arts and in comedy. Hey, agents and managers, it's cool that you've decided to up the diversity in your rosters. Thank you for that. However, please do not tell your white clients or potential clients that you love them, but you can't work with them because you're only hiring diverse right now. There's lots of unpicking of why that's such a pernicious, difficult thing to say in terms of your artists of colour, if anyone wants to look up and follow that thread. But there's this kind of sense that people really feel they need to respond to the issues raised by Black Lives Matter, but there's also real uncertainty about how to proceed, and sometimes people doing it in quite a clumsy way. Live comedy has also this summer had its own Me Too movement. So women comedians in particular really coming to the fore to talk about the fact that so actually things that were always kind of spoken about, but now are really having a moment where they're in the spotlight and people are refusing to keep taking them as the norm. So it was kind of always known, but now now there's a real movement against the idea that some performers and promoters on the circuit were behaving in a very predatory way, or were harassing or assaulting particularly women comedians on a regular basis, and that there are lots of very unsafe working practices, like being required to stay to the end of the gig when you're perhaps the only woman on a bill, say, and you're missing your last transport home, like being asked to carpool with people who you don't consider particularly trustworthy. So there's been a real kind of that kind of informality and we're all mates, and that kind of boozy party structure has also had, not surprisingly, sadly, but not surprisingly, this kind of darker edge where it's sort of covered up for people who have really had to try and maintain friendly relationships despite being made to feel very, very uncomfortable or actually being subjected to harm. So all of these crises, I'm going to argue, had real roots in ongoing difficult practices in the comedy industry that a better rethought approach to EDI really could have helped to solve sooner. So we're going to talk about some concepts here that apply to the comedy industry, but we think they're also good questions to apply to your own work context, whatever that might be. So the first one is to think about, okay, what does merit and meritocracy mean? So this is an idea that people are really committed to in the comedy industry, excuse me. So because there's a slightly romanticized, I think, view about live comedy settings. You're either good enough or you're not, you're talented or you're not, the audience are with you or they aren't, and it's really visceral in a live comedy setting. You can hear and feel whether the audience are with you or not with you. And because of this, I think it's very easy to think that it all rests on the comedian's shoulders, whether they are good enough or not good enough. And there's an extent to which that's true. Comedians need to take responsibility, and ultimately there's no one else to take responsibility for the quality of their product. But I think it leads to a myth about meritocracy in the comedy industry. So Jimmy Carr, someone who's right at the top of that tree, has said this very interesting thing when asked directly by another comedian, is comedy a meritocracy? He says, yes, not to the extent that the best do the best and people that aren't very good don't work. So I'd say already that's a pretty serious qualification on the concept of meritocracy, which most of us would associate with the idea that the best do in fact do the best. He says it's a meritocracy in terms of if you were good, you can make a career in comedy. As far as the circuit is concerned, so that's the live performance context, I think it's a meritocracy. People that are good do well in the clubs and they can make a living being a stand-up comedian. Everything beyond that, roll of the dice, good luck, right place, right time, getting on telly. So to what Jimmy Carr is implying there is that on the circuit, that it's down to just whether you're good enough, but actually if you want to get into those upper echelons of the industry, that's something he presents as arbitrary, essentially. Do you have the luck? Across the creative industries, though, we are having to understand that these things are not just down to luck, and that identity is a feature that impacts here. So this is from the Panic Survey in 2015, which found basically that it focused quite heavily on the idea that class really impacts your access to the arts, both as someone who might want to work in it and actually also as an audience member. But also found that women and those from Black and minority ethnic communities face barriers in addition to those associated with social class origin. Those respondents who were the best paid were the most likely to think that the sector rewards talent and hard work, and were least likely to see exclusions of class, ethnicity and gender in the workforce. A high proportion of respondents believe that success in their sector is based on hard work and talent, or meritocratic beliefs. And the survey respondents who were most attached to that idea were highly paid white men, irrespective of age. And those people who are in the best position to affect change are often the very people who most strongly support the meritocratic explanation. So the idea that everyone had a fair chance and it was the people with the best skill and talent who actually broke through. Talent as well is obviously an important idea in any kind of art form, and this is no less true of comedy. So this reference to Scouts refers to Scouts at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So these are people who do other kinds of jobs for most of the year. So they might be running a comedy venue, they might be working for a TV production company, they might be an agent representing comedy talent. But during the month of August, they go up to Edinburgh with the purpose of scouting new talent, of choosing people who are going to be appropriate for the sort of particular channel that they represent. And what Sam Friedman has highlighted in his really fascinating eye-opening study of what scouts do is that often these are people who are, in the absence of any kind of empirical evidence, making decisions that are often particularly highly driven by assumptions about class, about what kind of comedian belongs to what kind of channel. And he says that Scouts struggled to express exactly how they came to their aesthetic assessments. In the end, nearly all settled on the idea that Scouting demanded an eye for talent, which was an ineffable professional expertise that largely manifested as an instinctive, intuitive or gut reaction. Indeed, the notion of talent was repeated time and again as Scouts explained their judgments, but the Scouts couldn't explain quite what they meant by someone having the right kind of talent. So it sort of feels very much like it's someone who looks right. So I'm going to throw this, sorry, I'm just working out the technology. So I'm going to throw this back in the first instance to Tom and Lavinia to just kind of have a bit of a chat about what does merit mean. If people want to, they can post comments in the chat as well. So guys, these ideas about merit and what merit means, how far do you guys think in sort of your experience when we're talking about an organisation and the sorts of organisations you guys have worked in, which are really varied, does merit always mean subjectively what I need for the job, or does merit and the person who looks right, is that sometimes based on something a little bit more but sort of identity driven, or sort of about how the person presents themselves?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's got lots of complexity, that idea, hasn't it, merit, for thinking about in your workplace and hiring practices, and the idea of how we might we may base merit on our own personal experiences and standards, right? So it then becomes actually someone coming with a different perspective, different experience can contribute, but because we're unfamiliar with it, we then might see it as kind of less. So it's kind of a really, it's really interesting. In your quote from Jimmy Carr, I mean, there's a lot within that quote, right? Just the fact that just at different levels as well, how he sort of recognizes that at different levels it kind of shifts, and sort of the fact that he throws luck in the mix, and actually, if you're on the circuit to be seen in the first place, that's not luck, that's got some privileges around that you are able to travel around, be paid on a lower wage, don't have certain responsibilities and additional responsibilities. So the fact to just be seen in the first place, to be considered good, is already coming. It's just an unlevel playing field to begin with, right?
Yeah, and actually I should say, I didn't flag it particularly there, but the survey also suggested that people with caring responsibilities were at much higher risk of having to leave the industry, and indeed already are having to leave the industry.
Yeah, and I think on the chat, it comes down to this terminology. Someone's put, Lydia Saul's put, like, this idea of cultural capital, right? Cultural capital attached, and it's not always objective in a true sense for everyone. There are winners and losers. And that's certainly in my own context. We talk about cultural capital. We also talk about academic capital, that certain students arrive in a university environment understanding the mechanisms of a particular type of education. They have had their parents go to university, so they know the admissions process, and they know what you do in the first week of term, and how you get to know a library, and how you get to know halls of residence, all things that maybe aren't about the study of the subject that you've gone to university for, but all that make you feel secure in an environment, and secure enough to then excel at your degree, right? So that thing of the academic capital as well might, for us in the university sector, when you are in the classroom, then it might transform in that certain students, yes, are first generation students and don't have parents or family friend networks to kind of informally ask advice from, and then they are maybe hesitant that they can come to a lecturer or a professional service staff member for guidance. And it's just that sense of you just, I guess, just not knowing and not being familiar with, and not being in the habit of certain structures and kind of performances in our workplaces, right?
Yeah, well, I think the performances thing is really important as well to what DB22 has mentioned here about cultural capital being tied directly with economic capital. And I think also relates to Lydia's point that actually if you have these performances of being the right kind of person, and that might, I was quite like looking like Bear Grylls, because I come across these people who sort of talk like public school boys and present in this kind of very bolshy, confident sort of way. And regardless of what they say, seem to me always to be presented, described as being very credible when they speak up in meetings, doing really well in interviews and that sort of thing. And sometimes you hear about someone who's described as not having presented well, or not having done well in the interview, and you sort of think, well, did they not say the right things, or did they just not look enough like Bear Grylls, and did they not have the right accent or something like that?
Yeah. So presenting well versus
Tom nodding.
Yeah. Presenting well versus presenting differently, right? That's, you know, and that idea of going back to that point of difference and how we might relate it to that issue of meritocracy, you know, and thinking really clearly and really thoughtfully about what we need in jobs, you know, and our own expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And
so
Tom, did you want to come in on that? Sorry.
So I think one of the ways you I think seem to pick up on what Sophie was saying there, I think one of the ways you really do see this operating in businesses, and certainly one of the ways I've seen it in my experience, is through the interview process. And I think that it really highlights one of the key problems with the term meritocracy is the way that it's the direction it's facing. So meritocracy really is kind of focused on the individual, and it promotes a kind of understanding that that's the only way that we're testing for potential employees, students, colleagues, these kind of processes, when really it really undermines, it doesn't look back at the structures in place which are preventing people from being excellent. So one of the ways I've seen this expressed is in the interview process. So this is both as an employer, as a member of an interview panel at large institutions, and as somebody being interviewed. I think if someone presents what we call kind of the right habitus, that does very well. I think you're completely correct to say that you know, cultural capital and helps us get through these awkward situations, and then that, as DB22 points out, this does translate to economic capital. However, then there's also an element of recognizing ourselves and trying to kind of promote a version of ourselves, and I think this is something we do unconsciously, but I think it's something we need to be aware of when we're putting together interview processes. I've seen a number of times people do very, very well in non-interview components for job applications, and then when they've come to interview, just haven't been given the right level of cultural capital and skills, and you can really see that. And I've noticed those people get those positions and do really well. Funny enough, the people I've seen do really well in those interviews have all been straight white guys with at least 2 degrees. I say that from at least a slightly reflective position of being one myself. So But so I've seen that operate on both sides. But I think we really need to look about how, in which direction we're kind of looking. And meritocracy always focuses in one direction, which I think is a real problem when we're looking at our processes for application and appointment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should, I'm sure we will return to these really sort of hot topics, but I think we should carry on and move on to the next one. So I am going to, sorry, I just have to clear my screen. Okay, so the next concept I want to talk about is the idea that identity shouldn't be treated as an embarrassing or an irrelevant concept. I have to say, for me personally, this is something the comedy industry has really helped me to become more comfortable with. So this is the wonderful comedian Ria Lina, and I want to just share a bit. I can't retell her joke, but share something very funny that I've seen her do with audiences, which is to just say to them, how would you describe me? And there's a wonderful tiptoeing that happens with particularly white audience members around, oh, you're human, you're lovely. And she, of course, then sort of berates the audience, teases the audience for dodging any mention of her identity, and particularly of her skin colour, or speculating, because it's not, you know, easy to tell what her race might be. And I think this really fits with something that that is happening in a lot of comedy clubs, where comedians of colour in particular are encouraging audiences to really think again about their what we have as quite an embedded instinct sometimes to really kind of ignore identity and be nervous of talking about identity or referring to it. And something that I think we have to really pause and think about when we have those sorts of instincts, or we don't want to refer to somebody's identity, is the fact that emphatically people with different identities, that is part of their experience. So it's all very well to say we try it, we want the world to be identity blind and the same for everybody, but it isn't. So actually you're ignoring somebody's experience if you're saying we just do the same for everybody. You might not be doing something that's equitable for everybody. Sameness of opportunity is not the same opportunity for everyone. And I think sometimes this can translate into an institutional culture where, just like we have this argument about should we separate the personal from the political, which can be quite a harmful tendency in the ways that I've just described. Within our institutions, we like to have the same policy for everybody, because we like to try and treat everybody the same, thinking that this will be equal. And I think sometimes that just doesn't work. So these are some comments from a well-established comedy promoter. This is someone who I should say a few things about. So firstly, they are someone who absolutely wants to be progressive, wants to treat people fairly, and wants to do the right thing. This is someone who impresses me as a very generous person. They're also someone who has, as they'd say, been, one of the quotes here, been running comedy nights for 40 years. So they're someone who really kind of knows the industry and knows their own practices and is willing to reflect on their own practices. I should also say that most of everything that we're going to hear from this person is hedged in with a degree of uncertainty when speaking about it, and that he's frequently kind of saying, that this is just my view based on my experience. Okay, so first, I think interesting thing said by this well-established comedy promoter is that the audience just want the comedian to be good. Honestly, they don't care about their gender, whether they're gay, black, straight, and so on. So there's a real assumption from this comedy promoter that audiences, at least, are identity blind. That they really are just invested in the talent and the merit of the performer. He's also very reluctant to talk about the idea of some performers being marginalised in the circuit on the basis of their identity. So I don't think they get marginalised. I have never in 40 years ever heard a promoter say, I'm not booking that one because she's a woman. Never. Or because they're black, or because they're never. I would just say probably the people who would not behave that way themselves are not going to be the people who are most likely to be hearing that behaviour. He says the opposite is true, the very opposite is true. That is referring to the idea that if a comedian whose identity is in a minority on the circuit, so that includes women in the particular context of the comedy circuit, as well as people with disabilities, people of colour, that those people are likely to be snapped up very quickly by the higher tiers of the industry, so TV being the most obvious example, and made just too famous for the comedy circuit because that industry is so hungry for people who are in the minority. So he explains, statistically, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but statistically, most comedians are male. It's perfectly explainable that there's going to be a greater representation of male ones. The words marginalised suggest that they're somehow being kept out. So we'll come back to this idea of marginalisation, but I think what's interesting in the kind of identity blind logic here is that there's both an acknowledgement that identity is absolutely functioning on the circuit because there are people who are underrepresented in terms of numbers, and they are being treated differently, as this promoter very optimistically thinks that they're getting lifted out as soon as they are sufficiently skillful to be lifted out by higher tiers of the industry. So that kind of clashes with the identity blind sort of idea already, I would say. So this next section is the rogues gallery of people who absolutely are using identity at all levels of the comedy industry. So starting with our comedy scouts, what Friedman did was actually travel around with comedy scouts listening to what they said at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So a scout identified as Kerry explained her decision to sign a particular comic by saying there is currently a huge gap in the market for a young and charismatic black male voice. That's absolutely driven by identity. He said a number of scouts were also mentioning the recent success of a clutch of what they call t-shirt comics, young, white, attractive male comics such as Jack Whitehall and Russell Howard, who were described as safe and inoffensive. Comedy agents as well. So this is Deborah Frances White, and she has a podcast called The Guilty Feminist, which I highly recommend. And one thing that they do on the podcast is there's a particular joke form they use at the beginning where you say, I'm a feminist, but, and then you say something that really isn't very feminist that you're confessing that you've done. And this is one of Deborah Frances White's. I'm a feminist, but when I was seeking new representation, and a comedy agent replied to an invitation to my show with an email that read, I cannot consider any one of the female persuasion. That might sound sexist, but it's not. I lay in the bath crying and saying out loud, I wish I were a man, I wish I were a man, I wish I were a man. Whereas most of these joke formats get a laugh as a response, a kind of laugh of recognition, and oh yes, I've done that too, even if it's a bit cringy. This one really gets a kind of shocked reaction from the audience, to which Frances White responds, that seemed funnier when I wrote it. It's all true. And she later reveals that this was actually a woman agent who had said this to her as well. The BBC is also, and other sort of broadcasters are also absolutely alert to identity. So Danny Cohen is BBC's director for television, sort of notoriously now brought in the rule that there could not be panel shows with all male comedians. So he's obviously aware of identity and making that policy. I think there's also identity clearly operating, even if it's not being done consciously, we can only speculate, by the people who had been booking those panel shows and churning out one after another complete lineups of only white male comedians. And then I just want to also highlight a comedian's perspective. So this is a lengthy quote, but I think it's really worth hearing all of her experience here. I was called like political a lot when I started doing comedy, which I didn't really understand because I thought to be a political comic, you had to talk about like MPs and policy and stuff that was in the news. But then I think I realised that the way that people view me by virtue of being a black woman is that my presence on stage is inherently political. What I talk about, my perspective, is inherently political, and I just have to deal with that, much in the way that any comedian has to deal with people's perceptions about them when they walk on stage. I think that political has always been a label that people have associated with me because, firstly, of who I am, but also the fact that some of the stuff I talk about is, I guess, challenging. So this particular comedian, I think it's absolutely fair to say that her material can be political, and perhaps latterly has become very political. But it's interesting that for her, the first thing she sort of notices, I'm not trying to be political, but contrary to those nice t-shirt comics who have these safe and inoffensive identities, just being a black woman on stage was considered a political act, meant that she had to cope with the politics of her identity in a way that someone like Jack Whitehall or Russell Howard isn't having to do. So again, we're going to break for some comments and questions and responses from the panel. So I'm going to start by throwing to the panel. What about this idea that in organisations sometimes we don't like to recognise identity? Does that chime with your experience?
So yes, I mean that's certainly something that's chimed with my experience and all the policies that I helped write in my kind of previous roles. we were never encouraged to include any elements of identity. There was the occasional kind of exceptionalism, which you know, can express itself slightly problematically, but with the intention of, you know, making sure certain voices were included, or certainly we weren't excluding certain voices. But every time I've come to any kind of policy document creation, it's been very much kind of with the mind that everyone must be treated the same, or that will be creating problems, rather than understanding that when people often describe themselves as colourblind, you have to point out, well, no, you're not, because often those people are taking people on their own terms, and that's what they mean to when they say I'm colourblind. And that's kind of to be built back into processes and back into these. I think this refers back to the first ideas of meritocracy and how we make these kind of something Deborah Francis White talks about, the gateways. You know, how do you make sure that people are able to get through the gateways? Well, first of all, you need to recognise that they exist. And that they exist in different ways for different people. Therefore, you are going to have different approaches. And I think if we want to encourage, certainly in a kind of business context, the most talented, the most creative, the most committed people, I think we need to really examine how we kind of maintain those gateways, and how we're able to allow people to kind of get through them.
Yeah, again, just to comment on the chat about acknowledging someone's identity is so important, as it defines their aims and motivations, their vision, and what drives them. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we've been doing enough of that. It's certainly in the organisations I've worked for. I mean, I work for a university now. Before, in the past, I primarily worked in arts organisations and for community arts, and even community arts, which was about kind of identity, local identity, regional identity. You know, I worked in particular for a Chinese charity at one point. It was also still kind of like advocating for a particular minority ethnic group in a particular region, but also trying to kind of balance it out with that vocabulary of equality and not seeing differences and everyone's the same. And I think it's really important to see both, right, the differences and the similarities. And sort of, if you get the plurality of stories, the multitude of stories and experiences in the room, in your organization, you start that question of you realize how much we might essentialize identity and make it singular, and rather think about, you know, so many different rich experiences. And that is what's going, you know, the richer the experience in the room, the better the work that's produced, whatever that is, whether it's artistic output or business output, etc.
Yeah, there's a really interesting comment on the chat there actually from DB22, that it's an ongoing discussion in their workplace that we are all humans was once a progressive claim, and progressives seem uncomfortable when challenged on this. I don't know if you guys have come across that. I mean, I certainly have colleagues who really think it's doing absolutely the wrong thing to kind of look at or try to find out how things are affecting different demographics within the community of the workplace kind of differently, and who are really affronted by that idea.
It's right, that's a really interesting topic, because I guess it speaks to, you know, the idea of what was that, like a film industry thing of having a particular like women's award, right? And it's kind of like, it's a real shame that we still have to have it, but we still need to recognize that there is this imbalance in the first place to ensure. I mean, goes back to Tom's point about gateways, right? If you have to level the playing field first before you can get to that point where you say everyone's equal or we're all humans, right? And I think, I think it's really interesting that I think this is the moment we're in, right, of that change. The last while is that change of thought of we can't. The being blind to the differences and the inequalities is not actually helpful, because it's shutting those doors on people rather than getting us to a place where we can genuinely say things like we're all humans, we're all equal.
If I may just say, I mean, would it even be productive, do you think, Lavinia, to get to this point of we're all the same? I mean, I think sameness is not the same as equity. It's not the same as equality. It's still not. I don't think you could ever get to a position where you can say, well, in order to ignore somebody's identity, then that will in some way kind of promote a positive. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk about the kind of need to deal with the long-term structural problems. Not to disappear too much down a rabbit hole, but from my research, I look at communities who are trying to deal with exactly this, and certainly kind of one example I can think of. The argument is on gender lines. They say we've had 10,000 years of oppression of women. So, you know, we need to formally have structural things which rebalance this. So for their committees, they have one committee which is 50-50 gender balanced, and then another which is women only. And the women only have a power of veto because they're trying to deal with long-term structural imbalances. And they say, well, how do you do that? Well, you can't do that by creating an ideal situation now. We need to read back and we need to rebalance some of the previous issues. I think picking up on what DB said there, part of this discussion, I think you see it from the promoter. So the quote there from the promoter says, oh, you know, I've never heard somebody say that it's on basis of someone's identity that they've been excluded. And I think what's really being said in that argument is it's not an argument on talent, although it's set up that way. It's always structured back down towards the individual, but actually it's exactly that problem, isn't it? It's that self-justification of that status quo, and it's that you accusing me of being X, Y, or Z, and that kind of uncomfortability that can come from those things. And they are difficult questions, and it can be very uncomfortable. And that's something that I've certainly found working with different groups. You know, sometimes you do need to kind of break and use conflict in order to kind of create a new whole, and that can be very, very difficult. And I understand why businesses and organisations can sometimes want to shy away and avoid those difficult conversations. But I think in order to get to a position where we can actually move past those structural problems, we do need to have those awkward conversations, and people do need to kind of confront their own kind of long-standing opinions and beliefs on these things.
I have to say as well that, but you're absolutely right, but there's likely to be some awkwardness and some pain in terms of actually opening up these conversations if you're not used to them. But I have to say as well, it's generally in the organisations I've been in that have committed to doing that work, and I don't know if you two would agree with this, but it's always been less painful and less cringy than you think it's going to be before you get there. It becomes comfortable more quickly than you might think. I think as well, I also have absolute sympathy with some of the people who are struggling with this, who have been able to consider themselves progressive their whole life because they were not acknowledging difference, and that felt like the right thing to do, to have a we're all human attitude. I think sometimes these discourses move on really fast, and nobody sort of sends you a memo saying, you know, by the way, we think differently about identity now. And it can be such a brutal conversation in some of the contexts it's had in.
I think that's a really important point, and it also speaks to Tom was saying earlier about, like, you have to go back. You can't start from this moment. You have to reflect on what's happened before, and so for your point there about how it moves fast and it critically evolves, is I think that's so key to this, is to keep having the conversations. And that understanding that it's a critically evolving process, and that the terminology changes, and we will rethink things, and that's completely okay, because that's it. That's what, you know, to rethink is an important part of the process, an essential part of the process. And to look backwards and not try and fix it now, like really quickly. That's not what this is about. So yeah, those two things about looking backwards and also acknowledging that whatever you do is going to change, because that's part of this process. It's fundamental to how it's going to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. I think a really nice point. I'll move on to the next topic, so we're also sort of touching on it. But I'm going to just read out Lydia's comment. It was a really nice wrap up to this. I think you do have to be prepared to experience the brunt of people's anger and frustration as a representative of an organisation that has not met people's needs in the past, and how you can develop a strategy for future change in a meaningful way. I think as well it's worth remembering that most organisations will have and will always have a journey to be on. So, you know, it's most organisations are exactly in that position of trying to move forward. So you're not being demonised, and you're not alone if someone says you need to revisit your practices. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next portion of this. Okay, so this next concept is the idea of tokenism versus the idea of making space, and by space we mean real, kind of meaningful and authentic space. So some more words from our established comedy promoter. Okay. So he talks about how he arranges a bill, so the list of performers that's going to perform in a night, saying every club's different. I see myself as putting on a variety show. I read this interesting thing about a black comic. He says, I never knew you had any black comics because I never meet them, because they always only have one of us on at a time. And I've got to hold my hand up and plead guilty. I'm like that. You know, I'll tell you the truth. I try and put on a show with texture, variety. So to this promoter, one of the things they're doing when they're trying to create a balanced bill is looking at the identity of the comedian. Bearing in mind this is someone who is reluctant to acknowledge the use of identity, that they are looking at the identity of the comedian and considering that a kind of aesthetic part of their act. So this leads to, but what he's referring to, that I never knew you had any other black comics because I never meet them. This is something that is often complained about by women and people of colour, sometimes LGBTQ plus people as well on the circuit, that they are the token representative of that particular identity. And that means that, for example, as a woman, you can travel around doing lots of comedy gigs and very, very rarely meeting other women. Sort of in response to that, a tendency has grown. There's well, there always has been actually, a really wonderful kind of movement of clubs that are particularly trying to stage identities that are marginalised, so that are only for women, or that are only for black comics, for example, or only for disabled comics. Our well-established comedy promoter has some doubts about this. So I have a lot of doubts. It's a personal thing. I have a lot of doubts about these sort of theme nights, you know, black comedy nights, women's comedy nights, Jewish comedy nights, trans comedy. Now and again, once a year for a bit of fun, why not? Or you might want to put a night of clown comedy, see what happens, you know. So again, equating the idea of a platform for identity with a kind of an aesthetic form. So thinking about putting on a night of black comedy as being equivalent to putting on a night of clown comedy. So this is a comedian's perspective. So this is someone who is also a promoter, so they're a gigging comedian, but they also run their own nights. And this person runs nights which give a particular platform to women of colour. And she says, other than demarcated like certain circuit gigs, so for instance, the black circuit, there isn't a place where you can find like a lot of comedians of colour in one place, or just a lot of different types of representation on one bill. Because people tend to do a sort of selection box of comedians that have their own idea about categories. So they're like, oh, this is a woman comedian and this is a category, or American comedian, or black comedian, or a queer comedian. So this is where that kind of idea of a really tokenistic booking policy comes in. And when you see it from the comedian's perspective, you can start to see how kind of damaging it is, because that promoter is deciding to say that to identify this comedian by a particular identity trait. So to say, oh, well, you are on my bill first and foremost a woman, or you are on my bill first and foremost a black comedian or a queer comedian. So they are putting that identity onto the comedian, and then they're staging them in a way that means that that identity is really brought to the fore. So tokenistic booking has loads of hidden and also very obvious impacts. So for one thing, it really impacts the money that someone is able to make. So as a token act, so let's say you're the woman on the bill, you are probably not going to be the headliner if you're in a token spot. So you're in the cheaper spots. Because there are less spots for you, you are going to be traveling further than your white male counterparts. So in real terms, your payment for the gig is likely to be less. And also this is in a context where into that kind of informal working relationship. Lots of comedians do regularly perform at gigs that it costs them a lot more to travel there, or they're not getting paid at all to be there, so they're, you know, nothing about what they're doing is being remunerated at a big enough level, so it's costing them more to travel, maybe have to stay overnight, all those sorts of things, than they're actually getting paid. And that's done because it keeps good relationships going. And in the article I referenced earlier about these kind of informal working practices, there was a real highlighting of the fact that people wanted to look committed. So if you were willing to travel around and give your labour absolutely for free, that showed that you were committed to the idea of progressing in this industry, and that was really important to people. It impacts your ability to build a network with people who look like you. So for example, and this links as well to the idea of safety. So there's all sorts of things that are really important about networks. Having a network in comedy is just fundamental to being able to progress. And obviously people, we know of people that sadly we tend to bond more rapidly with people who look like us. So if you're not meeting people who look like you and share your experience, then that you're already at a disadvantage in terms of forming those bonds. But also something that came out in comedy's Me Too movement was women talking about the fact that the only way they had of protecting each other from promoters who would try to make sexual advances, for example, is to tell each other when they meet each other. So actually there's an important safety element in people being able to talk to each other. So tokenistic booking policies, when perpetrated by somebody whose intentions are rather grubby, really serves those grubby intentions. And then there's also this other wonderful concept from Deborah Frances-White. She just comes up with the most wonderful ways of describing things that are going on that you can apply across to loads of different contexts. She talks about tribal confidence. So this isn't the confidence that you yourself can do well, that you know that you've got the skill to do well at the gig or to present your points in a meeting or whatever. This is the confidence that we will be included because the group trusts us. So this is more to do with how other people are going to react to you, and over time, in particular, has a real impact on how well you're able to perform the personal confidence. So when applied to the comedy industry, and this is absolutely something that Frances-White means to apply to lots of different contexts. When applied to the comedy industry, it's talking about how if you are one of a number of people whose identity is valued on the bill, so that there are kind of 8 people who look like you, then the tribal confidence in the room is high. You're a white man, you look like Russell Howard or whatever, you're going to have that step ahead in the audience's estimation about how likely you are to be successful. If you are the only woman, the only person of colour, the only comedian with a visible disability on the bill, then you are being presented to the audience as someone who probably just needs to prove themselves that little bit more. So you don't know that you've got that tribal confidence. And I think a lot of us can think of moments in the workplace where a lack of tribal confidence would be exactly what would sum up our experience. So going back to this idea of no HR, this is just Kiri Pritchard-McLean, a comedian, putting beautifully an example of some of the risks here. If you work somewhere with a supportive infrastructure, please cherish your HR department, because a world without it looks like choosing to sleep in a train station because you know the colleague offering you a lift will touch your leg and talk about their dick the whole way back from Barnsley. So graphic and extreme though that image is, and I think comedians certainly are subject to more dangerous and more extreme situations on a much more regular basis than the majority of workers. I do wonder how many organisations really think about policies they might have about requiring staff to use the cheapest form of transport, for example. A policy brought in to stop people just booking themselves first-class tickets, but that can also, particularly to a newer or more early career member of your organisation, could that translate to we require you to accept a lift if it's offered, even if you don't want to? Could that translate to you can't leave the event early to catch the last direct train home, you have to wait around in a train station first thing in the morning? It occurs to me, sorry, in the early hours of the morning, it occurs to me that actually in lots of contexts I've worked anyway, no one sort of takes me aside and says, you need to make sure you feel safe in all of these contexts. There's sort of an assumption that if I'm committed, I'm going to make sure I do things, even if because the person I'm talking to thinks that I'm going to be safe in that context. So this idea of being isolated being really central to safety or lack of safety is something that comes out all over the place. It's really before even the Me Too movement, it was really kind of understood that this was a real problem for safety. So this is a survey carried out by Chortle, which is a comedy website, asking how can we make the comedy circuit safer. So these are anonymous comedians. And this theme of please don't have us outnumbered on bills, please make sure promoters put more than one female on an open mic night so we don't feel isolated. And then also references to this kind of idea that because you have comic license, meaning that you can say all sorts of things you might not say in other contexts, and because you have a kind of backstage atmosphere of banter, that can also lead to people feeling, to comments being said that should be challenged, and people feeling unsafe when they're not challenged. So for example, racist, sexist and offensive material is openly tolerated on the open mic circuit as people learning their trade. As a woman, it can be really disconcerting to have to sit and listen to a parade of men making jokes about assault or making sweeping misogynistic comments for cheap laughs. If promoters were more serious about this kind of material being unacceptable, it would make me feel much safer being around these people off stage. So here's one of the things that some comedians are, in my view, getting really, really right about trying to address some of these issues. So this is a poster for a night at Fock It Up Comedy Club, Fock standing for Femmes of Colour. So that's, they describe that as women and anyone who considers themselves on the feminine side of centre. So this is a night that stages lots of women of colour, so that networking issue, so lots of people who perform at this night really credit Kima Bob, who you can, I was about to say you can see her there with the microphone, also with her name written under her face, that's what am I thinking? So Kima Bob, who's the compere, and essentially she co-runs the night actually with a kind of slightly more backstagey kind of crew who actually also sometimes perform. Yeah, so Kima Bob books women who are able to then network with each other, and she's also very strident on stage about telling you that you must follow these people on social media. So there's a real kind of promotions angle as well. She's very clear this is about giving people the leg up in their career, that because of their identity they may not get in other spaces. And for that reason, the publicity materials tend to be kind of like this. They really clearly identify the people that you can follow. Sophie Duker, who's also pictured there, runs a night called Wacky Racists, which is about staging all kinds of marginalised perspectives. So it doesn't have quite the same emphasis on femmes of colour, but does also stage, therefore, a lot of women of colour, and has a similar kind of approach, that there's a kind of board where people's social media is written up, and you're really encouraged before you leave the venue to make sure you're following people on those social media. Interestingly as well, those two individuals, Sophie Duker and Kima Bob, who are very kind of well interlinked with each other, performing at each other's nights, supporting each other's nights, are often spoken about by other women of colour performing on the circuit as having been really important to helping them, enabling them to keep getting gigs. So this kind of personal network that grows up through these nights is really, really important. So back to Deborah Frances-White, in one of her wonderful ways of putting things, she encourages us to think about microclimates. And I think that's a lovely way of describing both Fock It Up and Wacky Racists, and indeed the other kinds of nights that exist to platform other kinds of identities. So there's a massive prevalence of these sorts of things aimed at different kinds of marginalised identities. Frances-White says, when we began the Guilty Feminist podcast, it was a play space and discussion house for women. It has grown its own culture apart from me, and frankly beyond my conscious ambition or intentions. I've realised it has become a microclimate where women are expected to do well, and where the audience have come to celebrate women and treat them the way men are treated in other places. And she talks about how sometimes, so the Guilty Feminist often takes the form of a kind of panel discussion, sometimes broken up with people sharing their work and things. She's spoken about the way that often when you have a man on that panel, they start exhibiting the same body language and lack of certainty as women often do when they're on the kind of Mock the Week style panel shows, or Have I Got News for You style panel shows. And Frances-White further says, the more environments that say yes to feminist, female and other marginalised voices, the bolder those voices will become, and the louder and clearer they will ring out into the wider world. If we all make microclimates, it won't take long for our collective efforts to simply be the climate. I think that's a kind of spirit in which these kinds of platforming clubs are offered, that we can create a climate and it will alter the climate of the comedy circuit at large. I also want to just highlight this thing that Sophie Duke has said about Wacky Racists, that it's also extending the audience who are involved. So what's amazing with Wacky is that so many people come who don't go to traditional comedy clubs and haven't necessarily experienced comedy before. And I think what Wacky's doing and what nights like others, including Fuck It Up, are doing are kind of disrupting that system of clubs. And I think to some extent, like, we're taking the audience of traditional clubs, but we're also opening up what comedy can possibly provide for people who have been excluded from it or who haven't seen themselves represented on stage. So actually Duke also talks about this as being good business. If you're doing new work aimed at new audiences, that's good for business. And she also says that she thinks if you keep doing the same thing you've always done, staging the same kinds of perspectives, that's eventually going to be bad for business. Potentially that's quite a optimistic view, because some nights that have quite, you know, tokenistic and discriminatory policies are obviously doing well. But I think this is a really good point about the fact that this isn't business concerns versus diversity concerns. This is those two things being absolutely allied. That there's been these really successful movies like Wacky Racists and Fuck It Up are both clubs that sell out very frequently. In fact, I can't think that Wacky Racists has failed to have a sellout in the last sort of year and a half, as far as I'm aware. Something like The Guilty Feminist has become this really massive kind of movement that's a smash hit podcast. Deborah Francis White has got a best-selling book off the back of it. Like, it's have really opened up brilliant business opportunities. So back to the chat and back to our panel on this idea of tokenism versus making space, because I think this is a really difficult thing to do as regards our own organisation sometimes, to sort of think about how we might make space and avoid working in a tokenistic way. I don't know what Tom and Lavinia think about that.
Yeah, I think it is difficult. I think I mean, there's several points here about this idea of a continual reflection and sustained, not trying to fix things now, a sustained process. And it's the same with tokenism versus making space, right? I mean, you might start thinking you're making space and what you're actually doing is tokenism, but if you keep reflecting on it, you can build into these proper arenas of space. And I really and space offers platform, and platform, like you said, builds network, builds confidence, and voices get heard and voices get stronger. So yeah, I think it's just that thoughtfulness again about the process of moving from tokenism into properly making space, and that is tricky and hard work. I think that's really important to underline as well, that this is hard work, and it should be. It you know, necessarily is hard work. If it was, you know, if it was easy, it, you know, surely we would have solved it by now. Or that's phrasing's awful, but do you know what I mean? That it's that continued sustained reflection, that process, that evolution that we're going through.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think to pick up on that and what Deborah Francis White says about microclimates, I think to look at those processes, I think we might need to include what we term positive exclusions. So this idea that you know there may be people, and certainly this is something we've done in the work. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about after this section in the arts practice. This idea that sometimes there are groups of people you do wish to exclude. You know, certainly from some kind of from interview processes or from groups and panels. If you are creating spaces for conversations to take place on a certain issue, maybe around a certain identity, there may be other identities you wish to exclude. Now that's something, it's a very delicate, very difficult process. You know, you've got to be very careful. I'm not arguing here that, you know, we should ghettoize all of our work meetings. But there are times when we're all aware of it. I'm sure we've all been in those meetings where these issues have come up, only to be told, oh yeah, we absolutely agree, but I think we need to do here is produce new data. People are using tactics in order to kind of push those conversations back. And I think there's a time when you think, no, actually the only people who need to be in this space, or certainly the only people who need to be given space, a license to talk in this space, are people of a certain identity group, or I think Fuck It Up does a great job of illustrating that. You know, they've got a very clear booking policy. As there's no straight white guys that can make it anywhere near being on stage unless they're being pulled up to be heckled or abused, which is a hilarious thing in itself. But it's made very clear from the top of the show, you know, there is no space for these people, and that's because there is lots of space for these people everywhere else. So this is about claiming this bit for us. But in order to do that, it means making that exclusion. I would certainly agree that would be a positive exclusion. I don't know about the rest of the panel.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, and also one that I understand why sometimes people who are on the receiving end of it feel quite affronted by that. You know, suddenly, why is my perspective not allowed to be included when we're talking about this? Why I have opinions on this? Why doesn't anyone want to hear my opinion on this? But sometimes, in order to really give space to voices that have been, particularly voices that have been marginalised for a really long period of history, people who don't share that experience have to be willing to listen. I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's being willing to listen, to understand that listening might involve using your ears rather than your mouth for a bit. It's awful, isn't it? That's like, sound like my mother. Being kind of willing to authentically listen to what people have to say. And I think something that you just sort of pointed to there, Tom, is this thing that sometimes happens where your problem is reinterpreted. So I understand why people get very frustrated when you're sort of saying, okay, we have a problem with properly including people with this identity. Well, let's go and check the data and see if that's really the case. That's a really good deflection policy. I've heard as well, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, people of colour saying, please stop reinterpreting this back to me as class. It does intersect with class issues, but actually we're talking about racism and we do need to call it by its name.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. Sorry, I completely lost my thread there. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I had a point as well, and I've totally lost it.
Sorry. Well, I'm going to read out some comments from the chat.
Yeah.
Right? Remember the wonderful things that I just deprived you of space to say. abusing my privilege. Lydia, with working with community members through consultation panels, we've been putting together a memorandum of understanding with some core shared values and respect emphasised between partners and groups as a way of trying to manage expectations. A really great idea. I'd love to hear more in the Q&A about how that's working in practice, because I'm intrigued by the mechanisms of that. Balancing different and sometimes complicated needs can be difficult to navigate, even creating and making divisions between community members in some instances. Try to collaborate, but be careful not to assume everyone will have the same aims or be willing to work together. Yeah, that's a really interesting point as well. I'm aware, Lydia, this isn't at all what you probably mean, but I think there's an interesting argument going on the comedy circuit at the moment about, okay, so there are clubs that have sprung up to preserve freedom of speech, as it is somewhat euphemistically termed, and what that usually means is a very particular kind of freedom of speech that is fighting against political correctness, as it might be phrased, but the idea that you can't say anything anymore, but that sort of also goes against the grain of what a lot of comedians think about political correctness as being, which is just a kind of kind dialogue. So you get nights spring up that in practice act as platforming clubs for some really discriminatory views, who think that something like Fuck It Up is also being discriminatory because it's excluding that kind of view, and certainly it's blatant about the fact that it excludes certain identities. They have Fuck It Up says it has a 100% no white dudes on stage guarantee. So that sort of thing about who's included and excluded and why is really pertinent to the comedy industry. And also, just from DB22, I'm part of a working class academics group, and we took the decision to exclude middle class academics, as we always had to start with addressing their fragility. Yeah, I think that goes to the heart of the, of the problem, really. Panellists, do you want to say anything else before we move on?
I remembered what my point was, Sophie. It's because you mentioned the word data, and then I was thinking about how data is so useful, but also so not useful, and how data conceals issues. And I've just done a project where I've been looking at a lot of data, but the numbers, like being on the ground in the organisation, I understand some of the issues that I cannot see from the numbers. Thinking through that when you are like addressing these issues and how to address these issues, how you have to find lots of different data and have, you know, it goes back to lots of different voices, and by lots of different voices we might mean you have like numerical data that shows you some things, but you need like empirical evidence as well. You need oral history testimony. You need a variety of tools to really think through what is exactly the issue and how exactly is the best way to address it.
Yeah, I guess one problem with data is that it's very top down. Sorry, Tom, but yeah, you have decided what you want to look at that point. Is that, sorry, Tom, do you want to say what you were going to say?
Sorry, yeah, no, I was going to back up and say, yeah, it's getting the philosophical underpinnings in place first is often a step that's overlooked, and exactly like Lavinia says, I think, I mean, quantitative data is very good at managing things. It's very rarely very good for kind of inherently understanding things. I think one of the things we've got to be very careful when we come to that, referring back to the point we were making earlier, is when people speak about their kind of known experience, if we then parrot back, well, can we prove that objectively? I think can actually be quite insulting. And certainly the kind of point I wanted to make earlier is when I've, in my role as at the university, I've spoken to a few of my colleagues and students of colour about kind of what can be done, what are the next steps, what should I do, and essentially what I've been told time after time is nothing. These conversations took place 10, 15, 20 years ago. Promises were made to our communities then that have not been fulfilled. So there's not a time now for us to stop and have that discussion again, because they were telling me that they weren't prepared to come to the table again until earlier promises were met. And I think we need to recognise that you know, we're not always starting from a clean slate. We might only be the first, you know, I might be just appointed as an EDI officer. This could be my first job as a head brewer, but there is always an institutional history. And we need to be aware of those things when we come to making these decisions and come to kind of looking and discussing positive exclusions and how we're going to approach getting data and solving these problems in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's going to lead us on really nicely to the part where I ask you guys about some of the practical things you've been involved with to kind of make these things happen, because these are difficult. It's not easy to understand how to you know, how to practically proceed, even if we can get consensus on these principles. And yeah, DB22, again, putting it very well. The research has been done. We need to read it, not commission yet another report. Yes, very, very good point. So this is really just me wrapping up before we move into the portion of the panel that's a Q&A that's going to start with Tom and Lavinia talking about things. So these are the things that I think any organisation can think about and reflect on from live comedy, and you are really welcome to come back at me with these things not being quite right or being too difficult. This is about opening up discussion. So firstly, think again about your definition of merit. So are you looking for the qualities you habitually expect or the qualities that you actually need? Acknowledge identity. Equitable arrangements may not be identity blind, and the people you work with may not want you to ignore identity features. Make meaningful space, not token gestures. So find authentic and open ways of listening. Be alert to subtle ways that your organisation might be exposing colleagues to harassment or depriving colleagues of positive microclimates or tribal confidence. And just bear in mind that precarious and informal working arrangements, while there can be things that are personally lovely about them for the people involved, and while they can, some organisations rely on them just to be financially sustainable, they can be ruinously unstable. So I would just, especially regarding diversity, so I just flag up that the comedy industry is a £500 million a year industry, but this summer has seen it on its knees. And as I've tried to demonstrate, the reasons for that, or many of the reasons for that, really go back into inequitable working practices that were there from the start. So moving into the Q&A portion, I'm going to ask Tom and Lavinia to talk about some experiences first, while everyone else has a chance to sort of get their ideas together, questions together, and post on the chat if you want to. If you want to contribute to the Q&A, there's two ways that you can do that. One is just to post your questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that. The other is to raise your hand. And the way you do that is to go to the participants icon on the bottom of your screen and click that, and you'll see in the bottom corner a little raise hand thing. If you do that, then we'll be expecting you to talk to us. So take your microphone off and take your camera off if you want to when you contribute. So on that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other. And I'm gonna, I think, ask Lavinia to kick off first. So what Tom and Lavinia are each going to do is actually talk about a particular project or context where these sort of principles have applied across to another kind of way of working outside of the comedy industry. So Lavinia, do you want to start us off on that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, is that me unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you, Sophie, and thanks for inviting me. And I think you particularly invited me because in my role within the university, within our School of Arts, I've had the role of director of EDI for the past year, and prior to that, I was sort of facilitating as deputy director of education something called the Student Success project, and we were looking at, this is the first aim, as many universities are looking at now, like diversifying and decolonizing curriculum. And with and this goes back to my point about data, with some of the data we were looking at what is called the attainment gap, meaning that in the data we were looking at, particularly, we were looking at how Black, Asian, minority, ethnic students not attaining the equivalent of what we would expect with the sort of white student population. But like I was saying earlier, that sort of masks a whole lot of issues, because you're just looking at results and you're not understanding why that is particularly. And it sort of masks also because it's grouping in particular ways. And it's conflating identities, and it's not looking at intersectionality, so it's not looking at things like we had earlier in the chat about cultural and academic capital, a first generation university student, questions of class, etc., questions of gender as well. So this myriad of different factors that impact a student. And also I've been reading a lot lately about just how problematic some of the terminology is, to call it an attainment gap, or maybe we should be calling it a privilege gap instead, a white privilege gap rather than a BAME attainment gap, because how that very language sort of centers a particular norm and centers a white norm. So that goes back to our idea of difference rather than the merit issue that we were talking about much earlier, to recognize difference and to decenter our perspectives. But with this particular project that then I started about diversifying the curriculum, having looked at the data, and realizing data was masking things and not understanding particular issues. And this goes back, I think, Lydia, you made a point earlier about collaboration and partnership. Is I went into partnership with a few students that I knew, Black women students, and they were kind of brilliant. And that collaboration really facilitated then a proper making space situations. So rather than just having one person say to me something and which one of the students had said, I said to her, well, let's have a forum on this. You've mentioned this one issue you have, and you obviously sort of you're in my class, so you know me. I, in my position as lecturer, can facilitate some space making exercise, and that you can bring other people into a forum, and we can have a proper sustained discussion about this, and we can then build on that. So we did a whole afternoon of sort of talks and workshopping, and it was called My Black Arts, and it was about these students within the School of Arts and their experience within that environment, but also about how they then wanted to break into the arts industry and the particular challenges they felt they faced, and that they could see were really visible from the lack of representation on the stage, or on the screen or on the page, etc. And what was really important about me working as a facilitator rather than an organizer of this event is that they led the conversation. They invited who they wanted to invite. They asked the questions and set the agenda themselves. And we did something called a kind of open space symposium, where there's no set agenda. You create the agenda on the day through who's in the room with you, and that you create breakout discussions that have no set time limits. The discussion lasts as long as it needs to last, and if it filters out, that's fine, and someone might propose another topic. So we very much got, and this is again the point about the data couldn't tell me this. The data couldn't tell me that the student numbers that I had about who was attending and who was achieving couldn't tell me the issues around engagement and the difficulties these students had and perceived and sort of felt within their environment. And that led to not just looking at things like results. We ended up just discussing not just things like diverse reading lists, but diverse assessment types, diverse teaching methods, the visibility of the staff, and that, you know, how staff engage with these ideas. And that, so if you go back to one of the points you made about people, you know, staff tiptoeing around issues they feel uncomfortable, and students going, well, if the staff isn't doing it, you know, am I expected to do all that labor myself in a classroom, you know? So it was just a really useful exercise. But again, to go back to that point about this being a process, you know, and Tom's point about, of course, there's a history there. So you're building on a history with an event like that, and then kind of moving it forward and trying to keep moving it forward. So on the back of that, we did write a sort of statement about diversifying our lists, and we had some aims, and we took into account that diversifying the curriculum isn't just about reading lists. People start with reading lists, but it is also about teaching methods, assessment methods, guest lecturers, who we get in to speak, what creative practitioners we get in to speak, and those sorts of issues as well, and that we address intersectionality in this statement as well, and that we also need to keep updating the statement, revising the statement, and build upon it and keep moving those aims and forward, and addressing issues, and keep talking to our students and giving them a voice, particularly when their perspectives are different to our own as staff members, or, you know, my own, you know, in my role, my own positionality, my own experience, what I see is not the same as what my students and colleagues are seeing. So to have those voices in the room.
Yeah.
So yeah, and going back to your point about when you make space and people get confident, it seems to me to be working in that. I think we're having more conversations as a school because we're doing more of this making space. I think the students are getting more confident in raising these issues because we're giving them arenas in order to, we're facilitating them doing it. We can do more. I'm not saying we're perfect. But on the back of that, last year we trialed a student rep EDI scheme. So that we're constantly having these conversations rather than having one forum a year. We're trying to kind of make sure that there are students, a body of students who will constantly keep a sort of a hat on with these issues in mind and come forward. And we've just appointed another group, a kind of group of 10 across all year groups to work with me, with other staff members to think through EDI practices in our School of Arts environment.
I think the point about it being a process is so important as well, because I think I'm obviously, because I've worked with you, I'm familiar with the context you're talking about, but I sometimes sense a tendency for people to say, oh, we can't do everything all at once, we've done nothing. If you see what I mean. It's slow progress. People are often frustrated that more isn't happening faster, and I understand that, particularly when it comes from the students. But at the same time, we would do nothing if we thought that nothing was worth doing unless it was everything, unless we could, you know, fix the problem overnight. I think as well, I'm really intrigued to just pick up on the open conference idea. So this is literally a process of providing space, isn't it? You invite people, you say, we have these rooms or spaces available, write down what topic you want to talk about, and whoever wants to go to that topic can physically go to that topic, and you can not go to that topic if you don't want to. And And I think that is such a good example of how you can provide space to listen rather than set an agenda and kind of expect people to fall in with it.
I think that's also why the students seem to prefer focus groups for talking about this topic rather than surveys, because surveys, you know, the questions, no matter how open you try and be with the questions, in writing the questions themselves, you kind of slant the agenda. Whereas if you have a looser focus group with maybe a topic word to kickstart something, you know, it kind of exactly goes back to that point about the students. In my context, the students are talking about what they want to talk about. I think that's, I think this idea of having different methods and different ways of collecting data to get the most comprehensive picture, and then to revisit it and to keep adjusting your policies, your activities to make those changes, basically.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Lavinia. I'm sure people will want to pick up on some of what you've spoken about or ask you about it in the comments and chat. But if I can move to Tom and ask you to just talk about your project.
Yeah, so I've been invited, I think, for a number of reasons, but primarily for the work I've been doing as part of the Tech Exchange project. So as a PhD student, I've been employed as the project coordinator on our university's component in this much wider social engagement project from Tate Modern and South Bank in London. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, will have been. I'm not sure if all of you will have realised that high up on floor 5 of the Blavatnik building there is a social engagement space. And there's some kind of really interesting things that happen on this. Sorry, I've got 2 versions of myself, and one is really delayed. It's I'm finding it a little bit distracting. So excuse me, just change that over a second. Sorry. That's better. Sorry, I've stored it. Yes, so we have this social engagement space I've been involved with, and as part of that, we've been developing a set of political and artistic practices that we this is part of the Activism Research Network at Canterbury Christchurch University, and we've been developing what we call the politically engaged artistic practice, which relates directly to kind of a lot of the topics being covered today, and we've tried to kind of make some progress through practice in how we start to address some of these questions. So we worked for the last couple of years quite closely with an artist called Tania Bruguera, who's a Cuban artist. She's kind of quite well known. She produces very kind of heavily political art. She calls herself an artivist, actually. And a lot of these ideas she's helped to kind of move forward and really kind of draw out some of the key components. And I think what we've taken from her mainly is this idea, which really just kind of expresses something we were doing anyway, but it's this idea of implementation over production, or kind of process over output. So it's this idea that it's, I think Lavinia illustrates very, very well with what you've been doing with the School of Arts, that as opposed to having this once a year panel, which we can point to and say, well, here's the thing we do, look, we're diverse because we have the panel. It's this appreciation that actually the panels aren't the output is not actually the work. It's not what we're hoping to do. It has to be in that process. It has to be within that implementation. It has to be kind of focused within that work. And there is, potentially no output. There is no end. It is almost entirely in the means of these conversations. And I suppose whether I'd, because summarize it has to be the thing. Right? It doesn't need to point to the thing. And I think you can see this in arts practice when you talk about kind of political art. Quite often, it's referencing a political moment. It might be something that makes you think about a political issue. The kind of practices that we've been trying to develop, and I think that are good political and artistic practices, which certainly could be applied in the workplaces where people are placed within political situations. So you should be making political decisions for yourself. And I think if you have to cognate and be part of that decision-making process, I think that opens up potentially new conflicts, but also potentially new synergies and ways of thinking and ways of moving forward within those paradigms, within those discussions. And I think it helps to reframe it within those specific contexts. So I've worked primarily with working class communities in East Kent, in Dover, And one of the methods we've tried to use as part of last year's practice, and something that we've picked up on, and something that I'm by no means saying is perfect or ideal, but is kind of coming out of research on the Occupy movement. And there was some research that kind of looked at it and said, oh, these people say they don't have any rules and processes, but obviously they do. What are they? And so it's on this kind of consensus model. And what we liked about that, what we thought was really an interesting and kind of key component of that is it's just a solid way of making sure everyone is actually heard. Not theoretically heard, but it's a way of kind of building in checks, balances, and ways of making sure that everybody has a role, a voice, and a way of veto, which I think is really, really key, which creates that kind of power. So there's this system of a kind of hard block, which, you know, it's a long process, it's laborious, it can involve, I'm sure, Lavinia, you've had similar experiences. These things can spin on, and we might need to have subgroups, and you know, it can be hard, difficult, long work. But I think what I found through this project is it's always been very rewarding. I've not always been in control of it. I think you use exactly the right term, Lavinia, facilitator. I think that's all we can ever be, is facilitating. I think at the point when we start to introduce questions, I think we're bringing in notions of hierarchy and expertise, which are really problematic in this field. I think there are kind of acceptable mother-son, teacher-student hierarchies that exist, but when we're trying to break down and make progress in these areas, I think it can be very, very problematic. I think we need to take a kind of long, hard look at how we deal with, how we mitigate our expertise and our roles in those hierarchies. And I think one of the ways we can do that is through the facilitation of something akin to a consensus meeting. I mean, this can be a scary process. For example, one of the groups we worked with was mainly composed of 17-year-old girls, and what they want to talk about was sexual assault. Now, I'm a guy in his 30s. I really haven't had the training or the experience to be able to kind of safely have those conversations. But rather than putting a hard block and moving on, I think what we did there was allow that conversation to foster, to take place, and for them to present it to us. They knew who they were talking to. And we moved to a position where actually what they really were interested in, what they wanted to work on and look at, was street safety. So a conversation that at the beginning, I mean, made me feel very, very uncomfortable, and I really didn't know how to handle. Just through listening and facilitation, we were able to get to a position where, you know, we were able to start finding things that the group could do, areas of action. And exactly like you say, so it can be all-encompassing, it can seem scary, it can seem big, but I think having these conversations and working through, and kind of, as long as we're aware of our expertise in these processes, we can start to tease out the small actions which will make really large differences in people's lives. And you know, that's kind of way that we can make sure people are heard to some extent. And I think if we kind of, I think it's going back. Sorry.
No, sorry. I thought you were wrapping up. Carry on.
No. Please go.
So I just wanted to highlight something you were talking about there, which is you call it laborious, and these things take time. I think both of you have spoken to the fact that you have to really be willing to invest time and energy to do these things well. And also your organisation, this is really difficult for organisations recovering from COVID, but you have to be willing to invest financially as well as your staff time, both of which are very scant resources sometimes, but these are things that, you know, you have to be willing to kind of open up the time and effort. I mean, just in terms of the impact of the work, Tom, I think about working class communities, you're working with young people, and you're going into a space like the Tate, which is, you know, it's a big art gallery. I could imagine that the idea of creating work there is both really exciting but also kind of intimidating, because I think it's not necessarily a space that people are invited into. So what did you sort of get a sense that you were working with people who were being made to feel more confident in an environment that they might have thought is not for me, or is that not?
That's the feedback that we've had from the participants. So I'll be honest, I stole it from a colleague. There's a research methodology working with young people that a colleague of mine's developed, which I think to those of us on the panel who are over about 25, we'll all agree that facing a camera can be quite a scary concept. It can kind of throw us off our game a little bit. Whereas what they've found, the research found, that when you put 17-year-olds in front of a camera, they're much happier to talk. Sorry, I've got my delay issue again. There we go.
Illustrating the point.
Oh yeah, but they've been quite forthcoming, and so some of the data we've had from them discusses exactly that. We, as part of this methodology study, we don't even ask the questions. We just kind of give them a camera, walk out the room, and see what conversations kind of come out of it. Now, with the caveat that these are communities who are evaluated to death. So, you know, I think every other day there's somebody in there evaluating them as working class students. So they are very adept at using the language. They're very, very good at knowing kind of what you want to hear. So I thought this methodology was particularly effective because we just gave them the time to get past those conversations. But certainly what they were saying to us is, you know, I didn't know this thing existed, and then I felt excluded from it. And now we feel that we're part of it and have a degree of ownership. And you know, there were some moments there that were really, really lovely, and we've had some really nice testimonies from the participants who, you know, I'm not going to claim that our political engaged practice has fundamentally, I can't prove for a second it's fundamentally changed these kids' lives, but I've certainly seen, they've certainly talked about the positive impacts it's had on them. You know, we've seen some of them go from being very shy to being in a gallery space with 1,000 people and able to command space, able to talk to strangers in a way they weren't before, able to present themselves in, you know, in ways that the people who have taught them for their entire secondary schools lives were really amazed by. And so I think has been success in that way, and it has been partially giving them confidence and instructing them on the power they already had. No, it's not it's you know, moving away from these empowerment narratives and very much pushing this idea that the people are already powerful. You know, we didn't train these 17-year-olds in the habitus of international art spaces. What they came to realise is they didn't need it. They had already this ability to work with people, to stand on a space, to explain themselves, and that kind of grabbing that, to go back to what you were saying earlier, that tribal confidence, I think was probably the most effective thing from any of the practices we put together.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to I really encourage people to post on the chat or to raise a hand if they want to contribute something. I just wanted to, and this is, you know, if you want to ask a question, if you want to contribute something from your own work, a sort of experience that relates to any of this, to get the ball rolling on that one. I'm really intrigued by what you say about people speaking in the language they're expected to, because they're so used to being evaluated. So I used to have a job, part of which was sitting with people, I was going to make this sound ever so much more grandiose than it was, but sitting with people at moments where they'd had a real kind of upset in their life, or they had got stuck, or they'd experienced trauma, and they were talking about something positive they could do to move on from it. So actually my role was particularly about helping people to find places where they could volunteer in order to get themselves active in the community again. And it astonished me how many people I spoke to who were surprised that I asked them open questions about things. It was often commented that I didn't have a clock over the interviewee's head, because normally if they went into somebody's office, they had a very tight time with that person. So the person being asked about their traumatic experience was very aware of sitting underneath a clock, because people were making very narrow time. That's about, you know, I'm not having a go at the people who have those really awful restrictions, but we were very careful, even when we did have to be very delicate about moving on to the next appointment. We were very careful not to make people feel that they were being constricted in terms of time. And yeah, just that thing of having a language where you think the way you tell your story has to be in a way that's going to enable you to get the thing you need from the person you're talking to, from the social worker or the GP or whoever it might be, and finding ways of actually signaling that you don't want that you don't want the authorized version. You would like people to talk about their experience openly. On which note, Tom, this is putting you on the spot, but can you talk us through, like, if you're doing one of these sort of consensus decision-making processes that give everyone the power of veto, that give everyone the opportunity to suggest something, I mean, literally, how does that happen? What do you do in the room with people to make that happen?
Okay, so let me just swap that again so I'm not being late. The kind of core process involved, it's basically just sitting down and explaining through some key rules. There is, I can post on the chat, or I can send out to people on email if that's more appropriate, a fantastic resource for this, actually, called seedsforchange.org, where this research done and occupied by some academics has been put into really usable guides. Some are for organisations, some are for charities, some are directly for business, and they're also making a good case within that literature then for how that will benefit your business. So the kind of, Jeff always gets to speak at the meeting and I never get to say anything, and that ends up being a problem. It causes us a lot of confidence, it causes us a lot of creativity. They're speaking specifically to that. But the way that we've worked it is we were doing what we had to call a kind of modified consensus. So the way these processes should work, if there's enough time, is we all sit down and everybody gets to have their say, no matter how many says that is, everybody gets to have their say, and then we come to the core part component is the decision-making process. And so the decision-making process, you have a kind of few options. So obviously, the straight agree, we allow a proposition to come through. What is normal in consensus meetings and that we had to limit on in this project is the hard block. So there's a stage where you can block without explanation, I'm not comfortable with this idea, we move on. That wasn't something we were able to do, we didn't have the time, so we did something called modified consensus, where you could have a block, because obviously that's the point of the consensus meeting. However, there did need to be then a counter proposal, something which is going to move the conversation forward. This can be something that's very useful. So we find this useful in political organising, right? When we're doing things, we're at actions and we need to make decisions quickly, there isn't always time for the full consensus process. So we do need the next idea to come, we need to move forward. So that's what we did here. So it worked with, essentially, it looks a bit like kind of hippies knitting yogurt, but we sat in a circle and we discussed everyone's point, and then we got to a vote on it. As soon as we came to a block, that we moved on to the next set of proposals. So it's just it's a slow process of making sure everyone's heard. But that vote stage and making sure that everyone can have some form of a block and making sure that they all are, have to be heard. That's the key component here, and that's what really I think separates this from, wider, more kind of open processes. Is that kind of specific drive towards that decision and making sure everyone's heard. So yeah, so if you find it useful, I can send those documents around, or I can post the link.
Yeah, no, if you put the link in the chat, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Also, I just wanted to pick up on the hippies knitting yogurt thing. I don't know if you've come across this as well, Lavinia, but this idea that when you're trying to do these kind of more open ways of working, that sometimes the kickback isn't that a bit loose, isn't that a bit uncontrolled? Did you come across much of that in organising these kind of more open spaces?
I don't, maybe because I work in arts, the School of Arts and art sectors, people seem to be more open to that. I think so. I mean, that's not to say that at some point some formality is useful, partly just to make sure that you're not just talking all the time and not doing any action. And I sort of take on board the point in the chat about the research that's been done. We need to read it, not commission yet another report. I think this idea of we need to talk about it and we go in a circle for so long that nothing moves. There has to be an element of movement. So no matter how I've worked with policies and I found them problematic, but at least they've forced if you work with a timeline, they force you to make a decision to move something on. And I think getting that balance back. So it goes back to what I was saying before about different methods and all methods, and maybe a scattergun approach. And maybe that works with my sort of just working methods anyway, of sort of being a bit magpie in order to gain a full understanding, but also to find something that works to shift it forward a little bit.
Brilliant, thank you. So I hope that's some kind of useful ideas of how you can do some of these challenging things around making space. We have another topic we can move on to for a finisher, but I do just want to kind of pause for sort of 20 seconds to let people make comments. Or I can't see anyone raising their hand, so apologies, just that I can't see it because of my shaky use of technology. But I'm just going to pause. Sorry. Yeah.
So just the point that DB22 has just made about structure and processes to stop having hear the same voices again and again. I think that's what the School of Arts, what I've been trying to do this year in my role, is to have that student rep system in place specifically for EDI, with the idea that the staff members are going to they're substantive and full-time, so permanent staff members. We'll just be talking amongst ourselves all the time as staff members about this issue, but the students' voices coming through each year, and to have a decent cohort of them, so we've got 10 of them, with the idea that their voices and coming through. I think we're trying it. I mean, it's too early to say. We did it last year. COVID sort of has, you know, stopped some things happening in the way we had hoped it would happen, but I completely agree with that point. There needs to be different ways of making sure not the same people always get heard.
Yeah, I think actually that knowing how to do that in really different organisations is so hard. But I think you know, something like the open space style of conference on your next away day, having a moment where people can perhaps anonymously propose topics that they want to have spoken about within the organisation, using this kind of, in those environments, using the consensus driven processes that make sure that it's not just the bosses and not just the majority, because we're talking sometimes about trying to hear minorities here, that it's not just the bosses and not just the majorities that get heard, are probably things that feel to me like they should be translatable to lots of really different contexts, I think. I'm just scanning down to check if we've got any hands up. It's absolutely fine if we can keep going if people don't want to feed anything in, but I just want to make sure I'm giving you a chance to. So I just wanted to, thank you to Lydia, has to go. Lovely to see you, thanks very much.
I've got a question for Lavinia, if I may. So with the student reps for the EDI role, is there a mechanism in place so that you don't just hear from just them, so that you know that there's a, you know, I mean, those of us that have worked at universities are aware that those students with a good academic confidence or a bit cheeky are the ones who are usually student reps. They're student reps for 3 years, and quite a lot of the time they're not entirely representative. I just wondered if you've got any processes in place. I mean, especially I know in the context at your university, there are a group of that group of Black societies that have got together recently and formed. I think that, you know, that sounds like a great resource for you guys. I wondered, is there anything in place to look beyond that, or is there?
So beyond having the student reps, one of the things we were supposed to have, but COVID kind of stopped, we were going to have focus groups. So we've tried surveys before, and as I said, the students find them problematic. They set the agenda partly. So we were going to have focus groups, and now we're going to probably move them online for autumn. They were supposed to happen in spring. So the focus groups are open to all students, and that would ensure other voices into the mix. And that what were you saying about making sure you have other voices apart from the reps? I mean, what's quite interesting is I think we have when we advertise for reps, how we phrased it might have not got the same sort of reps you might get for the person who has the confidence to sit in those meetings usually, you know. And one of the things that they've asked us for is to make sure, rather than going just to the formal EDI committee we have as a school, is to always have a sort of a pre-meet, an informal meeting with just myself, where they know me better, so feel more comfortable with me. And we're also trialing, you know, I have an office hour for anybody, staff or student, to drop by, and we've been trialing like an anonymous post box as well for comments. So it goes back to the kind of like scattergun, try a few things to make sure different voices get heard, and people might want to talk about a sensitive topic, people might want to make a complaint, and that becomes very delicate, and you don't necessarily want to put your name to it. So we're kind of aware of there's got to be anonymous kind of processes. The students reps are there to kind of facilitate that as well, in that students wouldn't want to come maybe to a staff member. This year we're going to concentrate, I think, on trying to get the visibility of those reps up within the student population, so that other students know who they are and who they can approach if they don't want to approach a staff member. And yeah, speaking to your point, Tom, about student societies, we're very aware of trying to better some of the links, both with you know, different student societies that maybe speak to different questions of identity, but also art societies where there's been underrepresentation of certain minority groups in the past. So we are currently talking with our reps about some of them maybe taking on the particular role of facilitating links with societies and reaching out to societies because they belong to them, and I don't, or staff members don't. So I'll let you know maybe in a year's time how some of those approaches worked, basically. But yeah, I think we're aware that we need different mechanisms for different voices, for sure. And the students are aware of that, I'm aware of that. So I guess we're kind of trial and error kind of process that we're in with how to get as many voices heard about a range of issues, and with that EDI lens on, yeah.
In just a few, thank you so much for all of that. In just a few minutes, I need to hand back to Marcus to wrap things up. But it occurs to me that, I mean, Lavinia, you kind of referenced it there, that the rep system didn't operate in quite the way that you had expected to trial it because of lockdown and because of COVID. A lot of what we're talking about works, or we're used to doing it in environments where we can all be physically present together. So I mean, is this lockdown a challenge not just for creating more kind of EDI issues, because we see a real difference in terms of technology, in terms of access to resource, in terms of having the network to keep you going, in terms of people having toddlers crashing in on their screen because they have childcare commitments and whatever else. Is it also, does it make it more challenging to address these things while we're all isolated?
Yeah, yeah. I think that there's different methods, right, as well, for how I feel, because I'm working with students, about I'm learning the different technologies they would prefer, right? So we're on Zoom, the university has Microsoft Teams, the students want to WhatsApp phone me, you know, and things about meeting people on their preferred terms, or mics on or off. I think it's challenging in the sense of, I think there's something intimate about the physical space and the face-to-face meeting of the physical space, and being able to read people better, and that we communicate with so much more than like words, and that kind of issue. But I think there's something interesting in the technology, like you said, the accessibility debate with digital accessibility, but also being funneled into use on student friendly, mobile phone friendly, and students who don't have access to laptops and have access to mobile phones. You know, WhatsApp is a way better means of communication than Microsoft Teams, for example.
Yeah, I think that's about organisations being willing to think quite differently about how they're going to manage all of their arrangements, really, and us all being, as in any kind of organisation, thinking about how we can keep these processes going using the technology that we have, because the situation isn't going to be perfect. As well, a really important point from DB22, that in university context, BAME students, this will be true for people working in other contexts as well, are suffering more through COVID than other groups are. And I think that as well, that the experience of different demographics of this lockdown is going to be really different, is really important to remember as well. So I'm going to hand back over to Marcus just a moment. I just want to say thank you so much to Tom and Lavinia for joining this panel, and for your really useful insights into how you've made things work. And thank you very much to everyone who joined us as well.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks everyone.
Wow. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you so much. A huge amount of effort has clearly gone into that in terms of preparation and presenting that. And it was I mean, the topic of EDI is huge in its own right, but what was really interesting was overlaying it then with looking at the comedy industry in particular, and that journey that you took us on for those last 2 hours was fantastic. And also thank you as well, being exactly on time, and here we are bang on 12 o'clock. So thank you, all three of you, for that as well.